If there's one thing iOS community does not lack, are attempts to rewrite or even entirely replace auto layout. I consider auto layout one of the top 5, maybe top 3 technologies to ever come out of Apple. It's beautiful, easy to work with, and there's nothing I can't do with it. It's Apple's choice for UI layout, and you should master it, not avoid it. Oh yes, you can see that was a blog post. Alexander, I really don't want to say the names of the people for whom I'm getting these quotes because I will ruin them. UIKit, Auto Layout, and Interface Builder are not supported by Texture, which is an open source project. It is worth noting that both of these technologies are not permitted in established and disciplined iOS development teams, such as Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. I shaved thousands of lines of boilerplate by leveraging auto layout. Many developers still insist on manual layout. Maybe they don't understand auto layout, or maybe they heard a story from a friend of a friend about how auto layout is slow. It isn't. I've seen too many developers, especially at large companies, invent in-house layout engines. That's just nuts. Don't bloat your app with a bespoke framework when Apple bundles a fine layout engine with the OS. Since iOS 8, we can use automatic height calculation without implementing mentioned method at the delegate of UI table view. To achieve this, you may use auto layout tool and row height variable to set UI view automatic dimension. Despite the ability to use these tools, I strongly recommend that you do not. And more, I recommend not using even complex math calculations on your way to define further height of a cell, only addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division if possible. But what about auto layout? Is it really so slow as I was talking about? Probably you'll be surprised, but it's truth. Incredibly slow if you want to see perfect, smooth scrolling in your app and on all actual devices which have long life cycles, especially compared with Android devices. And more subviews you have, the less quickly auto layout works. So, layout is one of those issues where lots of developers have very strong opinions. And I want to at least offer a suggestion as to why that is the case. When you are writing an app, you will have layout. While you might be able to avoid certain things in your app, like maybe you don't have to deal with networking if your app only works locally. You might have to not deal with certain data handling things because of how your app works. It might be simple or something like that. But your app will have layout. Every iOS developer has to do it. And also, it's probably something where a lot of your time is spent doing layout. Like maybe if you were to take a percentage of your time as a developer dealing with building an app, the layout and the UI aspects of that are probably a sizable percent. I don't want to give an estimate, but it's clearly higher than 30%, 50, could be 90 depending on various things. So your time is spent on it. Your mind is constantly thinking about layout. As a consequence, you start to develop an opinion about what is and is not the best thing to do. So as a consequence, everybody tends to have very strong opinions about how to do layout. Point number 2, apps are different. So actually, when you have an app, you may be solving very different problems from a developer who is doing a different app. In my second quote, for example, if I go back to the quotes, so this quote is by Texture, which is a open source framework done by Pinterest. Notice they say that Pinterest, Instagram, and Facebook all don't use auto layout. Well, let's think about this for a second. Pinterest, Facebook, Instagram are all social network apps that have a feed of content where the smooth scrolling of that content is very important, and they're trying to achieve like smoothness. They're trying to achieve 60 frames per second, something like that. So they're trying to solve one set of problems, whereas this post was written by someone who works on a camera app. It's about Halide, I don't know how you say that, a camera app, where for a camera app, you're probably not having a stream of content that's, needs to pull from a network and refresh and people can scroll endlessly. You're basically have a fixed screen, you have like a camera, and you have controls on that camera in a fixed screen. So the types of apps that people are developing are also very different and may have different types of constraints governing them. They may have different goals or different objectives that they're trying to optimize for. As a consequence, they may come to very different conclusions about layout and what is good or is bad about layout. Another thing to consider when developers are making apps are that oftentimes non-engineering factors also matter a lot in your app development. And I often talk about like the social structure of a lot of companies is as important to the bottlenecks in development or what choices engineers might even need to make as other things. Like for example, in some companies, the designers have a lot of power and the engineers have less power. The designers are able to say like, this is what your app will look like and it must look exactly like this and there can be no variation from this whatsoever because I have this great idea as a designer, and if they have the power behind them of the management, that is how it's going to work. So that means the engineers will have to do things for their layout code to achieve the goals of the designer. In some organizations, the engineers have power and the designers don't have as much power. So in that situation, the designers are like, okay, I'd like you to make a screen like this, and the engineers can say, well, actually, a lot of these things are very hard to achieve. Like, I don't know, you put some custom controls in here, but if I just use the standard controls, it's like 100 times faster, so I'm just going to forget about that and do the things that are a lot easier based on the frameworks that are there. In some companies, designers might be using storyboards directly, like they're actually doing the visual layout in a storyboard, and so the engineers might have to receive that storyboard and be able to work with it, things like that. So how companies work and what best practices different engineers come to oftentimes relate to social factors or the power structure of the business that you're there, not necessarily objective engineering decisions. So while people oftentimes have very strong opinions about layout code and about like what is good and what isn't good, and they oftentimes express those in very 100% yes, 100% no terms. In fact, there are a lot of reasons and a lot of different environments that a lot of different engineers are operating into, which plays into their opinions about layout code. So, this talk is Manual Layout Revisited. Yes, Ben has a question already.
Okay, I have sort of a question slash I don't know, I'll just say what I'm thinking. So there's a blog post, this kind of talks about what you were just saying about social feeds and the infinite scroll.
Sure.
So there's a blog post from Twitter, and I think this goes back maybe to the iPhone 3GS.
Yeah, I think I know what blog post you're talking about.
Well, I was going to talk about
smooth scrolling in a table view, like how did Tweety
and it says
achieve that? Yeah.
It says to just draw everything rather than use views.
Yes.
Any thoughts on this, first of all? And I guess that would be kind of my question slash whatever is obviously if you're dealing with designers that are you have to do it this way, that's kind of the fallback that you have. We were chatting yesterday and we were talking about some of the issues where for example, if you rotate the device, obviously you want to animate smoothly from one state to another where things stretch out gracefully. UI views will do that, I think, organically, but if you're drawing things yourself, I can't say that that's the case. You probably have to do some stuff, but Twitter, for example, they didn't have that problem because they didn't have rotation on their feed. So you couldn't rotate the device, it would always be a fixed width. So first of all, manual layout, why stop there? Or, why don't you just draw everything yourself if you've nailed down the design, you're making optimizations? Have you actually heard anything about performance of drawing things yourself?
would say really big questions, which I'm not going to handle actually at this time.
Okay.
Because that's this topic I fully know opens a really huge thing, like a whole, could go in a lot of different directions, and that answer is just too big, and I want to do this presentation and not get into like whether or not you should like be manually drawing all of your views and things like that.
Okay.
That's my answer.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, we can always talk about that after. We can talk about it during QA time, but like that goes down a rabbit trail that I'm not going to go down at this time. I'm going to talk about the things in this presentation rather than talk about that. All right, so I was here. Non-engineering factors also matter. So first of all, I do want to, when we get into auto layout, I want to think about originally what were the topics that were there, kind of historically. Why did auto layout get developed? What was there? So initially, when you were doing layouts on an iPhone, there were some cool things. Like number one, the screen size was always 320 pixels by 480 pixels. As a consequence, you could basically rely with very high precision on where things would go. You could actually hard code that value into your apps, and it was fine because every iPhone that existed had the exact same screen size. So people were doing manual layout, but it was based on that, that guarantee that you had such a screen size. So that happened for, let's say, iOS 2 to iOS 5 or so, and then we see here, this is the manual for UI layout constraints, or NS layout constraint, and you can see, where did we get that? From iOS 6 and above was when the constraints first entered the iOS ecosystem. And why did that happen? Well, that's an iPhone 5. So this was one of the first iPhones to really change the size of the screen such that you could now have, it's a taller screen, basically. But this was basically Apple's indication that the sort of guarantees that we had about screen size were not going to hold. We had to start thinking as developers about accommodating different screen sizes and things like that. Anyway, yes, I don't want to get to the second page yet. So this is sort of what happened historically. So I myself, as a developer, did manual layout for about iOS 2 to iOS 5. So when iOS 6 came, actually everybody pretty much universally hated auto layout. One reason for this was because it was really poorly supported in Interface Builder. And so like a lot of the features that it actually even had, like programmatically, you could do programmatically, but you couldn't do them in Interface Builder. And it was kind of confusing, things like that. So about 1 year later, Xcode overhauled like the entire system for doing layout constraints. At the same time, I don't know, I think more positive, it took about a year for the community to come, but a lot more positive like opinions started to surface about auto layout. So it was probably around that time, I'm guessing the iOS 7 era, when like more developers started to really support auto layout, and I myself, for about 2 years, was a very strong auto layout advocate, and I really liked using auto layout. And some of the things I really liked about it were, for example, although I usually use it programmatically, I did really like describing the layout of views in a really declarative way. Like you can basically just say like, okay, make the left hand of this view and the right, the left of this view and the left of this view are aligned. The right of this view and the right of this view are aligned. That type of way of describing it is much better than doing the calculations for manual layout, which you are continually doing. So, I was a strong advocate of auto layout until about iOS 9. And so here, let me describe the problem that I was working on at this time. So this is a collection view. And inside of this collection view, we have an image and we had text. And so that image was supposed to resize according to the aspect ratio of the screen. At the same time, so the text would be aligned here, and as you can see, I guess I'll go over here and take the mic. Some of the issues that we would have is that, so this text, I couldn't really control the size of it. It would depend on user input. So it's possible that this text would be bigger than the image. It's also possible the text would be smaller than the image. So the size of that collection view cell would have to be based on the maximum of either the height of that text or the size of that image. Plus, I wanted to use Apple's framework that was new from like iOS 8 that would say like, now the collection view is able to calculate its own height without my having to do like the cell for row. There's like a new framework for doing that it should be like automatically sizing. And my issue was basically that I could not achieve this layout with auto layout. It may be possible to do. I'm just saying I couldn't make it work because it would oftentimes work, but it would fail randomly at various cases, where it would be just sort of like most of the time it works, and then there would be this one time when my stuff would just go all over the place, and I'd get a constraint error, and it was very frustrating, so I was sort of like, well, I guess I'm just going to have to do this one manually. And that sort of opened up this way of thinking, because this is what code looked like. I was writing code like this way back in like iOS 2 or beyond. This is kind of, I think, what a lot of people's image is when you talk about laying out code manually. So it's a lot of really redundant calculations. I'm dividing stuff by 2, like all over the place. Finding the center of things, sizing frames, like all this. So a lot of times the impression that a lot of developers have of manual code, when one of our quotes said that they reduced like thousands of lines of boilerplate by using auto layout, I think this is the image that they have of like what manual layout usually looks like. And this is actually literally what I did for a long time. So that's not really an exaggeration. So having gone through the experience of using auto layout, however, I didn't really want to go back to this. I didn't really want to write a whole bunch of manual layout. Like, it wasn't like, I really liked the idea of being able to say like, okay, the bottom of a view should just be able to be set to the bottom of another view. Not that like the origin X value of that view should be equal to the whatever origin of this view plus its height minus the height of the other view. Like those types of calculations that you repeatedly do if you do manual layout. So I started to think about ways that manual layout code could be made more condensed and into like put into like much less code, so I didn't have to continually write this. Basically, I wanted to be able to write manual layout in a way that provided many of the same benefits that I got by using auto layout. That's one of the things about auto layout, is it really made me consider how I wanted to write manual layout code. One of the things that I found is basically, at least for me, you can consolidate a ton of manual layout code by writing really simple functions. So, for example, the heart of this presentation is that, I'll go back to this one. There are a couple of simple functions I'm going to describe, and when I use those relatively simple functions, I'm able to achieve a lot of the same types of layouts that I was achieving with auto layout, but the code itself I think is still pretty easy to understand, and it's also about the same amount of code as I would be writing doing auto layout programmatically. So that's the heart of this talk, is essentially to describe what those things I did are and sort of what it looks like as a consequence. So number one thing is, I added a lot of convenience methods to like UI view to make it way easier to use and to not have to do a lot of that calculation code. And actually these convenient methods are very easy to write. So anyway, I should have been doing this way back in iOS 2, I just didn't. basically I had to go through auto layout to realize that this was a good idea. The second thing is that it's actually pretty easy to write functions that work on a collection of views, like an array of views at the same time. And if you do that, it also can turn out to save a ton of code. So I wrote some functions that will apply changes to collections of views at the same time. The third thing is, it's also relatively easy to write functions that can arrange views in an order. So right now we're picturing like what a UI stack view does, essentially. Writing a view that would start with one and arrange it top to bottom is actually a for loop. It's not that hard of a function to write. So there are arranging collections of views is also relatively easy to do. And the final thing is, usually when you're doing layout code, I'll go into this a little bit later as well, you either are going to do one of two things. Either you have content and that content is able to overflow the size of the screen, by which I mean probably that content is in a scroll view and you can scroll to it back and forth, or you have content and that content needs to fit the size of the screen. And so you have to figure out how to size that content such that it fits the size of the screen. This is by far the biggest and most hard problem if you're going to do any type of manual layout. But a lot of ways that you might do that can also be realized with very simple functions. So, first of all, let me show some of the convenience methods that I wrote about, or that I'm talking about. So, these convenience methods are extensions to, for example, UI view that can make it a lot easier to reason about your layout code. They look like this. So for example, let's say you wanted to set the bottom of a view. You could just extend UI view with this type of computed property, and then if you want to set the bottom of the view to value 100, that rather than 100 could just be like viewcontroller.view.bottom, and that would put it on the bottom of the view controller's view, things like that. So that's one very easy convenience method that you could use to simplify your layout, and it's kind of quite similar to how auto layout has a constraint to the bottom of the view. Very similar in style. It's not the same, that doesn't work the same, but a very similar style of layout. So, another pro tip. If you want to change two dimensions at the same time, like if you want to align both the X and the Y axis in one call, you could also think about adding a convenience method to set corners of views. Then you can actually set both things at the same time. Also, really easy convenience method to write. There, bottom right corner. Oh, and I have a demo. So, here is my, I've already uncommented out demo 1. So, in this playground, I have put some views in a view controller, and I added some of the things that I'm talking about in this talk. I've included some other ones here, like width and height, other stuff. But here's my demo 1. I'm gonna not uncomment it, but this is effectively what I just did. Let me change. I think I already have the presentation, maybe not presentation large. Okay. That might make this a little more readable for everyone. This is a way higher resolution screen than in our previous. So you can do things like this. So here I set the width and the height. Now I can set the view controller's, this view to the bottom of the view controller in one line like that. So if you need to achieve some type of alignment, you can do it like that. You could also do bottom right corner to view controller bottom right corner, and provided that this playground actually completes, there you go, now you've moved it over to the right corner. So that type of thing can be done pretty easily, just with some convenience methods. Next thing is, now take those convenience methods that you just wrote and be able to apply them to an array of views. That's really all I'm talking about right here. So I usually use the naming convention of resize or reposition. So resizing would change the width and the height, and repositioning changes the position, the left, right, top, bottom, whatever. But essentially what this is mapping all those convenience methods to an entire collection. So it looks like that. I think that's a relatively easy function to understand. And then we are able to achieve things like this is something I usually do with 2 hands. Okay. Now if the playground gets around to, oh yeah. So what this one is doing, it's actually not that interesting to watch because it's putting all 4 of those views at the same spot. It's just setting their width and their height, but all 4 of those views are going to have exactly the same width and height. And the playground is unfortunately not always reliable because it should just be showing like one yellow view at the top and it's still working on that. Sometimes it goes faster if I do that, and then I do this. And it did go faster, as it usually does. Okay, so now you can see, so all 4 of those views are on top of each other to demonstrate that they're there. I'll just comment out the last one. Now you can see that the yellow one was on the top, now the green one is going to be on the top. And all of those views are set, all of their widths and heights set, just like that. So you can pretty much collectively set properties of all of those views.
The comma's still that.
Is it still, does it,
Comment out
Swift,
the comma in the array.
does Swift care about the trailing comma? I don't think it does. I think it's just the annoyance of the playground, which I often encounter. See, look how much faster it is. Now the green one is there. So, again, you can apply these properties to a collection of views to achieve relatively consolidated layout code. Okay. So now, next thing is, let's say that you want to arrange those views in particular order. Like oftentimes, when I'm given a layout, it's going to be that there's like one view, and then under that is another view, and then under that is another view, and then under that is another view. So this is, similar to like how UI stack view or something like that works. So it is actually relatively easy to do that with just a basic for loop. So in this particular implementation, there's more than one way to do this. Like for example, where do you start? In this case, I'm choosing the first view's top as the position where I start. You could also choose to specify explicitly where it starts. There's more than one potentially good implementation of this method, but here it's just going to take the top of the first view, and then it just puts the view's top to that position, and then it adds the height of that view, so then the next one is going to be laid out at the bottom of the previous view. So that is a method that can be used to arrange views from top to bottom, and I can demo this. So now what I did here is I've got my 4 views. I'm going to size them. For some reason, I set the width to -20. Don't need to do that. Anyway, now they'll all have width and height, but they'll be arranged from the top to the bottom. There we go. So if you want to achieve that layout, you can use a stack view, but it can also be done with a for loop like that. So you could consider if something works well or what you want to do, and that is the algorithm for arranging top to bottom. Now the last one is the one, this I'm really only giving you the tip of the iceberg of this problem. The resizing is the hardest part, but generally speaking, as I said, there's going to be 2 cases that you need to worry about most of the time, and of course that's not comprehensive. Maybe you need to care about zooming or something. But usually when I receive a design from a designer, they are thinking that either this design is going to fit on the screen or not. If it doesn't need to fit on the screen, usually I can just arrange it top to bottom maybe some stuff's over on the left or right or something like that. Or it does need to fit on the screen. Like a lot of times when you're doing some type of, your app opens and you're like swiping through the screens that give you instructions or things like that. Those types of screens, you generally do want the content to fit on the whole screen. So this usually means that you need to have some rule by which the views will be sized such that they can fit on the screen. One of the things that I have found since getting into this is that actually one relatively simple rule works in a lot of cases, which is that I have these views. So I have each one of these views. I have a screen that's this size. So then I take the difference of those two heights and apply it to one of those views to stretch it to fit the boundaries. That is actually what I want in a lot of cases. Probably over 50% of the case, that one thing can achieve the view, can achieve it. Oh, and that's what this slide was intended to communicate. That's pretty much what works for me in a lot of the designs that I've had to implement. So this is what that would look like. What this is basically doing is you're passing in so you basically have a collection of views, and you pass in one of those views and say, okay, this is the view that I want you to stretch to fit the size. So you get one view selected from that, then you just add up the height of all the other ones, and then you need to know the height that you're trying to fit, and then you're just going to resize that view to fit within that height. That is the main algorithm there. So it's just, essentially it's a summing operation and then a subtraction operation. Here for fun, to illustrate that, okay, there are other potential resizing operations that you might want to do. This is another resize function that I wrote that will basically say each one of these views would be sized with equal proportions. So like if you have 4 views, each one of them would take up 25%. So that type of layout can be achieved with just a function that looks like that. My point here is that resizing probably has more cases than the ones that I'm covering. You'll probably need to understand the layout and figure out what type of case you actually have, but oftentimes writing a resize function isn't so complicated once you understand what actually is the rule that you need to resize according to. Yes, and that's essentially what this slide says. There are a lot of potential resizing functions. Oh yeah, the other point about resizing that makes it a little bit more complicated is for resizing you might have to think about error cases that don't usually arise in the other case, which I've completely ignored here. So for example, let's say I'm resizing these views. Let's say that all of these views are huge. Like what if one of the views that I'm resizing is already bigger than the screen? But like just a single view. How do you resize? And it's not the one I'm resizing, it's just one of the 4 views. How could you possibly make that fit according to the rules? Well, you can't. So these resizing functions may actually fail. They may not be able to resize the content in order to fit the size that you were given. So at first, I was really worried about that, and I thought, oh, this is a problem. Writing resize code is really, really complicated. But actually, in practice, most of the time, I can actually basically know like what is the size of the views that I'm trying to resize to fit, so I can basically be comfortable enough that my code is going to resize correctly. Like if you actually have a design where there's a possibility that you have views that are like too big to fit and the content actually cannot fit in the screen, the real problem is that the layout is the wrong layout and it probably should be in a scroll view. Like the vast majority of the time when I would have a content that would not fit on the screen, in some case, it's really a mistake of the layout, not a mistake of that function. So then it's just talk to your designer and be like, hey, I think we should put this in a scroll view, as opposed to fitting it on the screen because I can't really fit it on the screen. So anyway, but depending on your case again, or depending on, like for example, if you have, maybe your content is generated by users, and user content might be really, really long. Even if you say like, hey, I'm building a Twitter client and it can only be 280 characters, Unicode can do some pretty crazy things, and maybe maybe you can't guarantee that those 280 characters are going to fit on the screen. So in those cases, you might have to think about error handling or different failures or different failure cases. So this might be too simple for your application. But for a lot of cases, for me, it's not, because I actually do know pretty much what the size of those views are going to be, and I will know that they fit. So you don't have to handle the error case. But anyway, resizing is definitely the biggest and most complicated of all of this topic. So what I just wanted to do here was demo some of the various resizing things. So here I've already arranged top to bottom. Now, oh, I shouldn't have commented out my thing that says it's a demo. And am I in, there we go, I was in Japanese for some reason. Okay, so, oh, this is the proportional one. I guess I switched it out. So this one is the one that I wrote right here. This one just takes a bunch of views and will resize them proportionally. So now you can arrange them top to bottom, then you can resize them all to fit that height. And I can also do top to bottom views. That's weird. It's not auto-completing this one. So this is my other one where I would resize. I can basically pick one of these different views and just say, like, this is the one that should be stretched to fit the content. So maybe I will choose view controller dot view 3 in views to fit height, and the height I'm trying to fit is the view controller's views height. Comma, what is it? Yeah, because I don't want that. And I don't want that. The view controller, and it's rolled over for me, thanks. View controller dot view dot height. And now the playground is going to render that, and it didn't work. Cool. Why didn't it work? Resize width, resize, maybe this is because resize views, did I delete the wrong one? And then I think I also need to give these a height. See, I shouldn't have edited that. So the reason why it's actually working now, but all of the views have a height of 0, because I should also I should give them a height, just like I gave them a width, which is what this method does when I give it a height and not a width. Coding while holding a microphone, much harder with height, and then I'll just give them a height of 100. Does that work? Hopefully this is easy enough that, nope, doesn't work. Okay, why didn't it work? These are the perils of editing your demo code before. So I gave them all the view controllers width, I gave them the height, and then I should be resizing view 3 in views to fit height. And that didn't produce the result I was expecting, and I'm not sure why. So I'll just continue with the presentation and figure that out later. Okay, trust me that actually works, and I had it working this morning, and it's fine. I use it in production. So, lots of things I have not covered, because my intention of this is to make the case that a lot of layout code can be achieved very easily with very easy functions. Now, I want to complicate that story slightly by saying, okay, well, what are all the things that I often do have to deal with that these functions do not really take into account? One of those things is maybe I want to have top or bottom margin, so I don't just want the views to stretch to fit the entire screen. I want to put some margin above or below. How can I achieve that? Didn't really cover it, but I don't think it's a particularly hard problem. Like, you might set the top or the bottom or something. You can just add another condition. Another thing I didn't talk about is spacing between elements. So that's something that I also am trying to, I also didn't cover, but really for example, this function here where we're doing the spacing, you can just specify like an offset. It doesn't just have to be here, you just add an extra property here. So lots of ways of doing that. Anyway, didn't cover that, but those are some of the easiest things that can be just making the function slightly more complicated. You can get more flexibility. I actually had a section in this talk about how to handle text size, which is one of the harder points about doing manual layout. So let's say that you have some text and you need that text to be sized dynamically depending on like the font or other things. I did not have time to put that in, but you can basically find the things in TextKit. Did my microphone die? Hello? My microphone is now dead. Good thing we have a backup. All right, so perhaps in a future presentation I can go over how to do this. I am totally not done with this topic, to be clear. There is way more that I have considered in terms of manual layout. This is basically just the foundational stuff that I wanted to cover today. So this is definitely a big problem. Another thing would be auto layout has the capability of aligning text to the first or last baseline of text. That can also be achieved with TextKit. So that's another thing that if you really need to do that, honestly speaking, I very rarely need to use that. But if that is something that you need your design to achieve, then it's possible to do using TextKit. Another one you might want to do that's not as hard is, I didn't cover, for example, you might want to size images according to their aspect ratio. That's another function you'd have to write to do this. Anyway, lots of other layout related things. Oh yeah, the last one is you may want to use leading and trailing rather than left and right, which is something that auto layout enables you to do. So how can you achieve that? The answer is that there are properties on UI view that you can use in order to just manually return left or right depending on what interface orientation the view is supposed to be. So lots of other things that auto layout does provide that can also be achieved with manual layout if you want to do, and I may in the future cover some more of those topics. My point mostly is that these functions are introductory. However, they basically capture a lot of what I need to do for layout. And I kind of want to make, so for me, what happened essentially was like, once I started thinking about manual layout in this term, and once I started to see that manual layout can be used with roughly the same amount of code that you could achieve a layout in auto layout, and you can kind of describe auto layout in a little bit higher level terms than just like, okay, set this frame here, set this frame here, set this frame here. Well, I started to use manual layout for a specific case where auto layout wasn't really able to realize the layout that I wanted to make. I'm now moving back in the direction where I'm using more and more manual layout because I'm finding that it works everywhere that I want it to work, about the same as how auto layout works, and I'm finding myself more and more feeling like there aren't that many scenarios where I really need to use auto layout. I can just use manual layout and relatively simple functions. So that is the end of my presentation, and I will now open it up to the floor. Yes, Ben.
Yeah, so kind of adding to my question from before, but simplifying.
Yes.
I was wondering, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I definitely don't. I think one of the things about this that's great is obviously that you can see the source code and you can see exactly what it's doing. One of the challenges with auto layout is that you don't really know what it's doing, and I think that's probably where a lot of the performance issues can come from. I mean, I'm sure that if you wrote like a super explicit, like error, like basically foolproof auto layout code, like it would maybe be doing behind the scenes exactly what you're spectrum of like extreme laziness and like writing a one-liner of auto layout when you could have just done it manually, and the time savings versus like peak performance of like doing everything super optimized with like, you know, manual layout and everything when it's like a really complex layout and things like that. Like, what is like kind of like what's the difference in like the outcome, do you think, like with the writing the auto layout? Sorry, I'm like losing my I'm really tired yet, but
Sure.
basically like what I think what I'm trying to say is like I would hope that Apple is trying to do what you're doing with auto layout. Like in a perfect world, I think that's probably what would be happening.
Okay, so I can take some of your
Okay.
points then. So point number one, auto layout is a linear constraint system. It's actually, Nami-san gave a great presentation about how auto layout works behind the scenes. It's known, the algorithm is known. It's called Kasuwari. You can look it up and see. But it's a linear constraint system, and as a consequence, I don't really see that auto layout is doing what I'm doing behind the scenes. Auto layout is a linear constraint system. You couldn't do the stuff that it does. Like in manual layout, maybe I didn't cover this. What you can't do is I can't say this view left, make it left, and then the next line can't be make this view right to this view, because auto layout would stretch that view and make it constrained both to the left and the right. But if you did it manually, it would take this view, okay, put the frame to the left. Now I take this view, put the frame to the right. So it wouldn't change the width to match the whole thing. Does that make sense? Like the way in which you can't lay out the code the same way manually and with auto layout. They are actually two different systems. Manual layout has no, what you could say, like no memory of the previous line, but auto layout does. Auto layout, if you set the left and the right, makes the width fit, but manual layout isn't that smart. That's a pro and a con of manual layout. Manual layout, the order in which you do things is really, really important. In auto layout, it's non-important. If you did one and then the other, it's still gonna lead to the same result, because it's actually just taking a whole bunch of things, throwing it at a matrix, and getting a result back from that matrix about where to put it. So I do think that some of the issues about auto layout, pros and cons, are intrinsic to what auto layout is and can't really be fixed by Apple. So that's point number one. The advantages also are the advantages. So
Just to respond to that really quickly, like if you set your priorities to be like in the order that you're talking about, like if like I'm doing like top to bottom manual layout, and I use those priority scales in auto layout. And by the way, I'm not an advocate of auto layout. I usually use manual layout unless I have to use auto layout for something that's just like really complex. Wouldn't it work the same way?
No,
But
it would not work the same way. It's manual layout has to be done. You would have to. That's one of the things about manual layout that's a disadvantage, is you have to think about the order in which you do things. And in auto layout, you don't. You just specify a bunch of constraints. It takes those constraints and throws it at a linear algebra thing that solves a matrix, and that's how it determines the views. So they are not equivalent ways of doing things.
even with a priority scaling, like
Um,
you see what I mean, right? Like if like my priority is like the first thing like 1,000, then it goes like 999. Like it would have to honor that priority.
I guess I think they're two different things, basically. Mathematically, I think they're distinct from one another, and they both can achieve the same layout in the end in a lot of cases, but they don't work the same way.
Yeah.
And that's a pro and a con, depending on, I like the fact that in auto layout I could say make this view's left here, make this view's right here, and it'll automatically adjust the width. And I can't do that with manual layout. I would have to do set this one's left to here, then set the width to this. I can't set the right. That would be, so if you're used to writing auto layout, writing manual again, I've made that mistake, so I know what I'm talking about. Like why I made this view here, and then it's like over here, but I'm expecting it to look like this. That's exactly because they're two different systems. But so that's point number one of your question, I think, was about can Apple do this with auto layout? They can't, I think. It would have to be something different from auto layout. They could make a new UI layout framework that would work like this,
Yeah.
but that framework would be pretty different from auto layout and would not work the same way that auto layout works.
Right.
Also, they would probably not be able to have it work inside of storyboards, because I think a lot of what auto layout is good for is that it can be serialized as XML.
Yeah.
Like and this is code, so I guess you can also serialize it as XML in a very much more complex way. But part of it is auto layout is able to be described in such a manner that it can be encoded in a storyboard. So that's anyway.
That makes sense.
But it would be so there are two different systems. So that was point number one that I wanted to address. Point number two is this is not about performance for me. So like I'm not advocating, people say that auto layout is slow, and I think that it's probably fast enough for most people for a lot of the applications that they're using. A ton of apps are using auto layout in production, and I bet you can't tell that they're using auto layout versus manual layout. So I'm not actually making the case that you should use manual layout because auto layout is too slow. I'm making the case that manual layout, if you refactor it with a bunch of simple functions, is about as easy to understand as auto layout. I'm actually probably believe it's easier, but I don't want to necessarily go that far. Because, for example, the debugging is so much easier with manual layout than it is with auto layout. For anything that starts to get a little bit complex, because the functions are very simple, I can just print out where all the frames are, and usually I can very quickly determine where I went wrong. So my move back to manual layout has a lot more to do with, like, I think it's easier to write code that I understand, that is easy to maintain, and easier to debug, than that it is more performant. But it is true that you may, when using auto layout, hit a case where it's too slow, especially apparently if you're Facebook or Instagram or Pinterest, and you have a very heavy investment in really fast scrolling scroll views, then also maybe you would have to use manual layout for that reason. But that's not the case I'm making.
iPhone 10.
Yes.
Release.
Yes.
iPhone 10 is new layout.
Yes.
New keyboard, new navigation bar.
Yes.
I have to make new system, new logic.
Uh-huh.
Also, I think now, so tired.
Uh-huh.
iPhone 10, new navigation bar. No, my library. I think now.
Yes. One problem that one danger of manual layout would be that you can hard code, you can code manual layout under assumptions that will not hold true in the future. So hopefully the lesson of like iPhones are no longer 320 by 480, that lesson sinks in. I would say if you're doing manual layout, you should be really careful about what UI assumptions you are making. I do fear somewhat a future to which Apple doesn't give me enough information in manual layout to be able to achieve something. But right now, for example, iPhone 10 has safe area. The safe area are insets, and I have access to those insets. So like doing manual layout, I think updating, if you wrote your manual layout code in a particular way, you still have access to the safe area insets. You can still code for an iPhone 10 and adjust the position and everything, and I know what the number values need to be, so I can incorporate that into my manual layouts, just like using the layout guides and things that Apple also provides if you're using auto layout. But it is true that you should always, and maybe in manual layout it's easier to make assumptions that will not hold true in the future, so you should be careful about those assumptions. For me, the biggest danger that I fear about doing manual layout now relates to like, what if Apple requires auto layout in the future or something like that, which I really don't think that they will do, because really auto layout is just a system built on top of setting frames, which is all that I'm doing. I don't really think they can do that easily. But it also might be the case that, for example, we get a layout guide that we're supposed to use to put positions and not an inset or something. So maybe I wouldn't have the information available in manual layout. So, yeah.
Restart tired.
Yes. So it's a big danger. Okay. I've got 2 questions. Is that okay?
We're running a little short on time, so maybe just one more question.
Oh man, I really want both of those questions. Okay. Inami-san.
Do you have any plan to make the layout system more abstract because you are relying on UI view, right?
Yes.
More like, let's say, cooking AppKit, NS views, and make those layout more independent from the actual view.
So I think your question is, could I hypothetically create a protocol called FreeMobile that requires the existence of a frame and then be able to use exactly the same layout code on a UI view, a CA layer, a sprite kit sprite, a UI collection view layout attributes, all the same because they all happen to have frame properties? I've considered that. Is the answer. So yes, it can be made more generalizable than just this. This is the beginning, and there's a lot of things that I have thought about far beyond this presentation, but my point about this presentation is to make the case for manual layout and see what happens.
I'll make it really quick. I saw you working on this like years ago, right? So
Yes, you were there when when the original problem
and,
surfaced.
Since then, have you found any good libraries that deal with, do these functions, convenience functions for you in open source?
Among the stuff that I would say is, this idea is totally not unique to me, and in fact I'm pretty sure that I came across people doing this like way back in iOS 2 and 3, and I just ignored it at the time because I was like, oh, that seems like a lot of extra code to put in my project or something, whereas now I would be like, why wouldn't I have done this? Some of these other things, a lot of people don't seem to be doing operations on collections of views that I've seen. I mean, there's layout kit and stuff, there's async, there's other layout frameworks. There's also people mimicking React or mimicking Flexbox or things like that, other layout systems. But I don't see too many people doing just like operations on a collection of views. But maybe it's out there. And I think I have to wind down now because Derek's looking at me. Oh wow,
I've been looking
super
at
long presentation.
Yeah, I've been looking at your entire presentation because you're presenting.
Yes, that's true.